Hey guys, John here. Today we're in Falcon 3, and in today's video we're going to be making a drum kit, so you can follow along and build your own kit and then kind of just change it from there to however you would like it. So in this video we're going to be making a drum kit that sounds kind of like this. And then in context, Alright, and on this front panel, I basically just put the kick, snare, and hat volume, and then a little bit of the hat decay, which we're going to get into in a little bit here. So a quick tour of kind of how this works here. If we go into our edit page, we basically have different key groups for our kick drum, our snare drum, and our hi-hat, and we're kind of just processing them individually, and then we can add different reverbs to the snare and the hat, but not to the kick, and kind of stuff like that. So with that being said, let's open up a fresh instance here of Falcon. So we can go to this top left and go to new program. And now we basically just have an empty program. It says new program over here. So basically what we can do, if we go here to the edit page, the first thing that we usually think about when we're making a drum kit is, okay, what is a kick drum, right? There's a low fundamental, and then we have a little bit of noise. So we can combine an analog oscillator, a noise oscillator, and kind of fine tune it from there. But the cool part about Falcon is there's an oscillator that lets us do just that, which is the drum oscillator. So here in our oscillators here, we have the analog, which I was just talking about, but down over here on the bottom, or not the bottom, but below the analog, we have this one called drum. So if we drag this all the way here, we can always go to the top if we want this to be triggered for every key, or we can kind of drag this down to have this specific to a certain key. So in my case, what I'm going to do is drag it onto one key, and then I want this key right over here because that's the one that's most comfortable for me. It really depends on what key you'd like for it to trigger the sound. So what we can do is we can zoom in here, and then we can kind of look. So I want it on this key right over here, this F. So let's bring this over here like that. And then we hear this that we're going to turn into a kick drum. So if we scroll down here, we can see this drum oscillator here. And the interesting part about this is that it's all set up for us to make drum sounds, and we don't really have to combine too much stuff. It just makes it very, very easy. So the first thing that we can kind of do here is here's the sine wave. We can change this to whatever shape that we want. Generally, I like to keep this for a sine wave for the kick drum. So we have this, and we look at the frequency right here, and this is 1K. So a nice place to start off if we double click this here, the slider, and we can enter 50 right here. So we have 50 hertz as a fundamental. We have a lot of noise. Let's kind of focus first and bring the slider down to the oscillator. And we kind of have just this low end kind of thump. Now, there's a couple different knobs here. Now, this is going to be kind of where you want to tweak the kick drum sound, right? So we have the depths. Basically, how far is that pitch envelope moving, right? Because when you hit the kick drum, there's always that envelope, that pitch envelope that kind of just goes really quick. Sometimes it's hard to notice, but it's always generally there. So this is the depth of how much pitch change that we want, and then the rate is how fast that's going to happen. We have something kind of like this. So quick little hit here. And it fades out really, really quick. So that's why we have this amp here for the attack and the decay. So as we increase the decay here, we kind of get something like that. And keep in mind too, once you hit this note and let go really quick, the release here for the envelope is going to be pretty much right here. So we kind of want to increase this a little bit. So we're kind of letting the oscillator take control of that. So once this is pretty substantially up, we can really see this decay shine through. And you can do some nice, interesting 808s if you'd like to with this kind of process. Totally depends on how you want to do that. So for this, we are keeping this on one note, so it won't get triggered here for anything else. But if we do spread this across a couple of keys for whatever reason, if we kind of like that thing here, make sure to go to the note tracking, double click that and hit 0 so we don't change anything while we change different notes, because that can get a little annoying. It depends on how you want to do it, but I usually try to keep this off. But like I said, we're on one key, so it's not really going to change. Even if we change keys or change a different, or press a different button or a key on our keyboard, it doesn't really matter in this case, but just kind of know that's there. So we have this here, that's kind of a long decay for a kick drum. Maybe that's a good place to kind of start off, maybe 5, 10, 4 now. We can always come and change this here. And these are going to be kind of how you want to, I guess, dial in your sound, right? Okay, so now we kind of have our main low end kind of hit here, and now we have the oscillator slider between the noise and the oscillator. So all the way up here, we're just going to be hearing our noise. So I think the left-hand side is going to be our fundamental, and then the right-hand side is going to be for our noise. And we kind of just blend these into taste. And something to be aware about as well, generally once the kick drum hits, that noise is kind of almost going to hit first, and then the low end fundamental is going to come in here. So if we click this here and kind of just slowly drag maybe just a little bit of this up here and maybe something like that. So the noise kind of hits first, and then we have the low end fundamental to kind of carry it up a little bit. So this sound is really up to you, kind of how you want to dial that in here, but the decay is kind of long. So let's kind of bring this back a little bit with this decay slider. And then the tonality of this noise here, you can dial in with the frequency and the EQ here. Something kind of like that might be fine. And from here, what we can also do as well is start processing this drum a little bit differently, how we would kind of like to contour. So for the most part, this is kind of how this works here. There's also some other sliders here that you might want to look at. So distortion a little bit goes a long way for a kick drum like this. So maybe just a little bit adding distortion there. And then these velocities are very, very cool, right? So we have one here for the oscillator, for the pitch, and for the noise. So if you really want those velocity settings to apply, if you're kind of making something a little bit more dynamic, then kind of keep these here in the back of your mind. So for example, we probably don't need one for pitch here right now, but if we brought this oscillator and this noise all the way up, and we looked in the piano roll, we kind of went down here with low velocity. We have a more dynamic kick drum. So definitely kind of leave these a little bit up here or kind of mix them into taste. But something like this really kind of helps make the kick drum a little bit more, I guess, realistic, more human vibe, right? So we have something kind of like this here. So now on the key group or the layer, depending on how you want to do things here. So for example, what I can do here is add an effects here, and I can go to the equalizer and then go to maybe a digital EQ and then go to our default. So now we can kind of carve in the tonality of our kick drum that we want. So 50 hertz is our fundamental here. We can kind of carve out what we want here and then bring up the top end a little bit to kind of get a little bit more of that noise through. And then cut up some of that mud. Some of that stuff. Right about there. So that might be kind of cool there. And then we can always add a compressor after that. So go here to the dynamic, and then we can use the Opal, the new one. I do kind of like using the feedback compressor for this a little bit here. Bring our threshold all the way up and kind of slowly dial this in. Maybe 4:1 could be fine. And just a little bit of compression is fine. We can always soften up our knee a little bit if we need to. And then for our attack, let's raise this to maybe like 10 milliseconds, something kind of like that. A little bit of makeup, maybe. Something kind of like that. Okay, so basically now we have an EQ and a compressor here. So we have our kick drum for the most part kind of there. We can always come in and tweak it later, but I kind of just want to show you the process of this. So now let's say we want a snare drum. So we can drag this drum here to the next one. So my next note is going to be right over here. So I'm just going to grab this drum here and bring it all the way to the bottom so it triggers this here. So now we have a brand new one. Now, depending on what type of snare that you want, generally more higher pitched ones, the fundamental is going to be around 200 hertz. You could go as low as maybe 150 or 140. But again, that kind of is really up to you how you want to do that. So go here to our frequency. Let's double click this here. And for this snare, let's maybe do 200, something like that. So you have something here, and it's already pretty close to a snare. And remember, increase this release here so we don't have this release basically blocking our decay here. So that's going to be our fundamental there. And then now we have our noise, and let's kind of dial in how we want that. We can also increase the attack just a little bit here. And then here is really going to be the tone of that snare, that kind of those rattles. Maybe a little distortion as well. And then again, for the velocity, let's bring the oscillator and the noise up. You could do the pitch, it's totally up to you. So Now we kind of have a snare here. And we could maybe increase the rattle decay a little bit more. Something kind of like that. Maybe bring up the overall volume of that. Maybe now that I'm listening to the kick, maybe that pitch envelope is a little bit too much. So we can just click on this key group here, and it brings us back to our kick drum. So maybe the depth, we can bring this down just a little bit. Or we can alternatively increase the rate. Really depends on how you want to dial that in. And maybe reduce the decay just a little bit here. Okay, so now we have basically our kick drum and we have our snare drum. Okay, next thing, we can add a hi-hat, and for me, I'm going to put it on this note right over here. So we can grab another drum and then bring it right down over here. And I'm sure you can probably get the process now. So if we want to do a hi-hat, we generally don't necessarily need a fundamental, so we can bring this noise all the way to the top here, and also increase this release here. We could even just leave it there depending on that sound or the that style that we'd like. And let's bring these up. Actually, we don't even need the oscillator for this one. We can just do the noise for the velocity because that's going to come important a little bit later. Maybe a little bit of distortion. So now we kind of have a basic kit with no effects yet. Right? So it's pretty basic here. So let's go to our snare and kind of just dial in a little bit of that sound. So here in the key group, we can add another EQ. So go here to the digital EQ default, and then kind of just find the fundamental, which on this one we did 200. And that's to kind of give you that a little bit of that poppiness of that snare drum. And we can always high pass this here because we really don't need all that stuff down there. And then a little bit for maybe around 1K, kind of that chest a little bit if we need to. And these are all kind of arbitrary numbers. It's kind of just in that general range. So maybe a little bit like that. And there's also that kind of almost that undertone that's kind of a little boxy. Maybe something right around here so we can kind of bring that gain down just a little bit. And then go ahead and compress that a little bit. So go to our dynamics, and then we're going to use the feedback compressor once again, bring our threshold up, and maybe 4 to 1 could be fine as well. And then slowly kind of bring down our threshold while we're playing this here. It's even a lot here, so that's kind of pushing into this a little bit too much. So let's go back to our oscillator and kind of reduce our volume. Something maybe like that. That might be fine. And maybe a soft knee, and then always change our attack to a little bit, to maybe 10 milliseconds. Maybe 9, somewhere in there. Just kind of have to listen to it. And then bring up our makeup a little bit. Okay, so that's okay for now. So what we can do here on our key group, we could bring up our gain just a little bit if we would like to. Or alternatively, we can always alt-click and reset this and maybe put maybe a drive or kind of something after that. So for example, we can go to the drive distortion area. Maybe the diode clipper might be interesting on the snare. Kind of gives us just a little bit extra to work with there. And now we have our hi-hat. So let's go to our hi-hat here. And maybe that might be a little bit too bright for this. So let's bring this down maybe. Bring our Q down. Something like that. So that's the basic kind of sound for our hat. And then let's go to an EQ and kind of carve out a little bit of our sound here. So digital EQ, let's go to a default. And for a hat, we really don't need any of this down over here. And here's kind of where you just dial in the tonality of it. See, maybe for there might be a little bit too much of the fundamental for our snare. And this is kind of the thing where you kind of just have to keep playing with it, doing some small tweaks until you finally get something that you like. So here, it's a little bit too much of the fundamental. So we can just grab the slider and slowly move it a little bit more towards the noise. Maybe something kind of like that. And then, yeah, maybe you could do a little bit of depth if you'd like to. Totally up to you how you want to do that. But that's pretty much okay for this. Okay, so now we have a basic thing set up. If you want to do something like cymbals, it's kind of the same process as the hi-hat. Maybe find a different range of the EQ and change the envelopes out a little bit as far as the these ones down here, so the decay, and kind of just make it ring out if you want to do something like that. And you can do a lot of different percussive sounds if you play with this noise and kind of change the filter sound. And keep in mind, you don't always just have to use the drum oscillator. You can do some weird FM stuff to make different percussive sound. This is kind of just the process. So we have all these stuff on, or all these things on different keys. Okay, so this is cool. So let's say we want to start adding some effects to like the snare, right? Because on our main drum kit, we have reverb and reverb on the snare and the hi-hat. And if you look at the other one here, if you look at this instance, we can see that for our snare here, this is actually internal reverb here. So if we go to the tree menu here and kind of scroll down and open up with the kick, but the snare, open these up a little bit here, we can see that we're using a send. So if we open up the aux here, we can see that there is reverb on a send here. So I'll kind of show you how to set that up, which is really cool to kind of keep things a little bit in-house. So this is what we have so far. So what we can do is, if we're on the snare, let's go down to our tree list here, and we open up these layers, and we should probably start actually naming some of these key groups here, right? Because after a little while, it's going to get a little bit key group 1, 2, and 3, right? So what we can do, we can go to select this here, we can double click on the key group, and this first one we know is going to be the kick, so we can say kick, and then this second one down here, we can double click and say snare, and then our last one was our hi-hat, so we can just put hat for that. So now we have all these key groups here, right? We can click these, and we can kind of see. Now we want to do some reverb on the snare. So we open up the snare here and we say, okay, this is the send here, the slider. So we need to go to our first aux. We can double click this here and then find an effect. So obviously we're going to put some reverb on there. So Sparkverb is going to be fine. And let's just try the default out for now. So we have that here. And as we increase the slider here for our snare, we start getting reverb only on the snare, right? The hat's still dry and the kick is still dry. And then we can always dial in our settings if we would like to. For now, the default's going to be okay. Maybe we can give it a little bit more of a low decay. Maybe a little less high decay. But yeah, that's kind of the process here. So now let's say we want to add the hi-hat. So all we have to do is scroll down here to the hi-hat, open this up, and we can see this send here. So we can start sliding this in. All right, so now our hat has reverb. Yeah. Okay, so now we basically have kick, snare, and hat. So the cool part about Falcon is that here on these different key groups, right, we've been putting stuff on the key group. We could have put them on the layer if we'd like to, but it's nice to put this on the key group because we can do things all individually, so they all change and they're all individually processed, which is kind of nice. So we can do something different here on maybe the program level, which is going to affect the entire program, or the layer, right? Because we're really just using one layer, right? Which is just our drums, which is kind of nice. You can split it out into a whole different ways, but I've kind of found this way is kind of cool, right? So for example, on our layer group, what we can do is even add a, maybe a diode clipper or a maximizer, or even do that on the program level. So let's go to our program and let's add a little bit of drive and distortion, add a diode clipper here. Just a little bit like that, nothing too crazy. And then the nice little final icing on the cake, I suppose, is adding a little bit of a maximizer to the whole thing. So we can go down here to the dynamic and add our maximizer and put the threshold all the way at the top for first and kind of just bring it down a little bit. And what we can do here, we can actually add a new pattern so we can kind of just key something in real quick. So we can put some 4 kicks here, something kind of like that. For this here. Maybe some hats, something kind of like that. And let's paint these in a little bit close to like that. And then maybe put our snare in here like that. Now remember the velocity thing, that's why I said this is important, right? Because right now, all of these are going to be the same velocity. So for example, what we could do, if we select all these here, we see these velocities, and we can kind of just move these around, make it a little bit more organic, something kind of like that. And then for these kick drums here, these are pretty low, so we can increase these here if we want that tonality. And then same for the snare. And for that, even in this scenario, we almost kind of feel like we want a little bit more of the high end for that kick drum. And maybe we can always increase the volume of the kick as well. Maybe do that on the key group too. And then later on, we're going to add some macros so we can kind of mix this here a little bit too as well. Maybe for that hi-hat, I kind of maybe want to go a little bit brighter for that. And this is really the fun part where you can kind of just scope around and kind of just dial in the sound that you want for that. Okay, so we have something kind of like that so far. And with our maximizer, once we start increasing this here, kind of glues things a little bit more. Okay, so we have something kind of like this here. Basic drum kit, nothing too crazy, nothing too fancy, but I do want to show you how possible and how almost obtainable something like this is here in Falcon. So we have our info tab, so maybe there's a couple things that we want to put on macros, maybe our kick drum, snare drum, hat, and like I had before, the hat decay, which is really useful in case we want to change things on the fly. So what we can do, we go down to our edit and we look at our kick drum here. So these are all on different key groups. So for our key group here, we can always go over here. We can alt-click this to kind of put this back to default. We can right-click this, and then we can go to, where is it? Assign to macro, add new macro. That's our first one. Then go to our second key group, which is going to be our snare. And then we can right-click here and go to assign to macro, add new macro, and do the same thing for the hat here. Hopefully you kind of get where I'm going with this. So add to macro, new one. And then here in the info, we have these three, and we can edit this here. And we can say, for example, kick, and here is going to be our snare. And then this last one here is going to be our hat. So we have something kind of like this here. Now these are going to be the volumes for all of these. Right, so we can turn these all down. We just have our kick drum. And we can kind of mix in our snare. And then slowly fade in our hi-hat to however we want it. Okay, so this is kind of a cool starting spot. And then over here, the decay, what I was telling you about as well. So if we go down over here and we go to our hat, we have our decay. So we can right-click this decay slider, go to add to macro, and then add new macro. And then here in the info tab, let's put hat decay. And then now we have something like this here. So this is 36 where we had it before. We kind of use this as a kind of a toggle of how open or closed you want the hat, or you can make two different hi-hats. You can make it first hat kind of like this, kind of a closed hat, and then you can use a brand new oscillator or just copy that one to the next one and kind of just increase the decay a little bit so you have an open hi-hat. Really depends on how you want to do that. So what we can do as well, back here on our edit page on our hi-hat, sometimes people like to put the hi-hat a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right. So it kind of really depends on what you want to do. So for this key group for the hat, we can kind of just move our panning a little bit here. We kind of want it a little bit to the left if we want to simulate that. Kind of really up to you in that sense. And another thing you can add as well, so for example, we have all of our effects here. So if we scroll down on our list page and we see on these aux here, we see that we have our reverb, right? So if you want to put this send on a different macro, if you'd like to, so for our snare, we can always right click this here, add to macro, and then add new macro. And then we can go back to our info tab. Now we have this one over here. So we could edit this here and say snare verb. Oh, I spelled that wrong. Oh my goodness. Snare verb. Good Lord. Here we go. So we have our snare verb. So all the way to the bottom. So we have our snare verb there, and we can do the same thing with our hat. So let's go ahead and do that. So we have our hat, and we can right click this here on our hat and then go to assign to macro, add new macro, and then we can go to edit and then go to hat verb, something like that. Or you can even just do that on the reverb dry wet if you want to do that as well. It's totally up to you here. So on this one, if we look at our reverb, double click this here, this right here is 50% or 50% dry wet, which technically we should be all the way at 100 if we're using it as a send. So in this case, let's bring this to 100, and you can always just put this on a macro if you'd like to kind of just have the overall reverb level. That's another way to do it too. That's the cool part about Falcon, is you can kind of really design it however you really want to. So back in here, we have our hat verb as well. So if we kind of just brought down these kick and snare, then we have our hat there. All right, so let's go ahead and mix these once more. So we have basically something like that. And like I said here, you have all these key groups to choose from. You can make some really crazy percussive sounds. So if we got another oscillator, for example, and let's drag this drum here to another key. Let's say maybe I guess I'll use this guy. Something like that. We could even just use that, right? Right, something kind of here, and then maybe... right, some weird percussive sound like that. Give it some distortion. Maybe bring down the gain a little bit. And then we can go to a key group, do a little bit of EQ as well. So something maybe digital EQ to kind of the same process here. And here's kind of our peak there. Maybe soften that up a bit here. Something kind of interesting there. And then maybe we can do a little bit of distortion. So maybe a diode clipper again here. Bring down our gain. Give it some nice distortion. And for this here, we also have our main amp envelope for this guy. So we can make the whole thing kind of just a little bit quicker. And let's say maybe we want to add a little bit of something to this. So our key group here, let's relabel this to maybe perc, some kind of hit like that. And then open up this drop down, go to the bottom here and give it a little bit of reverb. And then maybe kind of pan this however we want to. Maybe we want a little bit on the right. Maybe it's a little bit too much verb. And then since we have the volume for everything else, we should probably do the same thing for this guy. So we could probably go to right click here for the key group, and then we can go to assign to macro, add new macro, and then go to our info tab and then kind of just take care of that here. So this is going to be perc right here. So we can put that here. And then for, I guess it really depends on how we want to organize these things here. Maybe like something like that, something like this here. And then maybe the reverb is going to be under the hat and the snare verb is going to be under the snare, something kind of like that. And then, yeah, it just all depends how you want to set things up here. So maybe do it after the snare. And we could even put something like this on a delay as well. So before we kind of wrap up the video, because I think you're hopefully getting the concept here, let's say we want to put a delay as a different effect and use that as a send as well. So we're going to scroll up here on our list here, and then aux1, remember that was our reverb. So we can always stack more stuff on this if we want to, but we can always use aux2 and we can maybe put a delay on this as well. So if we go to our effects here, we can grab something like this dual delay X and then bring this in here. And then maybe some of our presets here, the rotation LP8 dot, it's kind of cool. So we have that for our delay. And if we scroll down here to our perc, we can maybe use that for 2. And remember the mix, if we're using this as a send, we might want to go all the way to 100%. But yeah, that's the kind of, that's a whole process with that there as well. So basically, this is kind of the process, putting different oscillators on different key groups, triggering that, and then kind of just adding our own effects there, which is a pretty powerful kind of thing to do. Which, you know, after you spend a little bit of time, you can really dial things in and make your own drum kit. And from there, once you kind of have everything mapped out, the snare or the kick, the snare, the hat, you can do the same thing with toms. It's basically like a kick drum. It's just the fundamental is going to be a little bit higher, but it's essentially the same kind of concept. And maybe make some interesting perk stuff, maybe stuff with FM synthesis or something like that. Label out and kind of map all of your keys to all your drum kits. And then you basically have a template to work from. From there, you can kind of just make a save as and maybe increase the decay on the kick drum for a longer kick or something like that. Maybe put some more distortion on the snare, change the snare tuning. Basically, long story short, you have a template of a drum kit, and then you can kind of just tweak it from there. So your homework today is to go and try out this process here and kind of familiarize yourself a little bit with this as well. And you'll be kind of surprised how cool and how almost intuitive it is to make a whole drum kit. I know Falcon is a lot. I know it's kind of at first like really kind of, I guess, confusing. There's the oscillators on the key groups, and there's the layers, the programs, the multis. It can feel a lot, but the more you kind of work with it, you kind of understand this hierarchy workflow, making you be able to make stuff like this. So yeah, that kind of concludes the tutorial. This one went a little bit longer, but this process is a little bit longer working with Falcon. That's just kind of the nature of the beast. So yeah, with that being said, hopefully you learned something, and we'll see you in the next video. We're going to play us out here with our little retro tune that we made. Have a good day.